Greetings and welcome everyone to the TheFutureEconomy.ca's live panel and Q&A on decarbonizing Canada's industries. This is the third and last panel in our series on Canada's future energy pathways presented by Shell Canada. I'm Florent Thévenin, or Flo for those who know me. I'm the director of TheFutureEconomy.ca and I'll be your host for this session today. So we have, I think, over 100 participants already, and they're trickling in more and more. Based on the registration list, they're from all across Canada and even from Africa and Asia and Latin America and Europe, of course. So really, really exciting to have all of you from all around the world. I recognize some familiar faces as well. Nice to see you again. People who attended the previous panels or simply friends of TheFutureEconomy.ca, if I can put it like that. So today, we're going to be talking about three major topics. One is the current state of industrial decarbonization in Canada. Two is the kind of partnerships and collaborations that are needed to achieve decarbonization. And three, the decarbonization of specific sectors. And because of our panelists today, we're going to be talking about transportation and buildings and heavy industry. At the end of our discussion, there will be calls to action from our three panelists. So make sure to stay till the end so you don't miss that. And then we'll also be taking 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm very excited because I see questions have begun coming in before we even began this panel or before I began talking. So keep them coming. We will be fielding them through and asking as many as we can. And obviously, you just put them in the chat. You know how that works by now. Also like to remind everyone that your mics and your cameras are going to stay off during the whole conversation. If they're on, please turn them off right away. Before we begin, we're going to do a quick poll. We'll be doing two, one now and one at the end of the call. So the first poll is going to come up on your screen now. The question is industry on track to help Canada achieve net zero emissions by 2050? So it's on your screen now. Just take a few seconds. While you do that, I'm going to be introducing our panelists for today. I'm going to start with Tonja Leach, who is the Executive Director of Quest Canada. Quest is an NGO present in Canada that is working to accelerate efficient community-wide energy systems with the vision for Canada to become a nation of smart energy communities. I hope that works. Tonja, hello.
Hello, nice to see everybody.
And what's more, in January, Quest and the Community Energy Knowledge Action Partnership, CCAP for short, launched a free renewable energy planning resource for municipalities across Canada. So perhaps go and check that out after the call. Next, we have Robin Silvester, President and CEO of the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. Good morning, Robin.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
The Ports Authority has more than $1 billion in infrastructure projects at the moment, including 2 container terminal projects and a number of rail and road infrastructure projects. So perhaps Robin will tell us a little bit more in the context of the decarbonization of those projects. And last but not least, we have Adam Auer, who is the Vice President of Environmental and Sustainability at the Cement Association of Canada. Hello, Adam.
Hi, everyone.
The cement and concrete industry is the largest supplier of building materials in Canada, and its goal is to become among Canada's clean economy leaders and to transition to carbon neutrality through a combination of innovative technologies. I'm sure we'll talk about technology during the panel. You should see now the result of the poll. Is industry on track to help Canada achieve net zero emissions by 2050? 36%, by far the largest category, say somewhat disagree. So it'll be interesting to have our panelists perhaps try to convince us otherwise. Well, look, thank you all very much for joining us. I also want to thank Shell, who is the sponsor, or Shell Canada to be specific, for this panel and for this whole series. They've been a great partner to work with, a great facilitator of this kind of conversation. So thanks to them a lot. So let's get started with our conversation and our first topic, the current state of industrial decarbonization in Canada. And I'm going to ask Tonja first to tell us how she thinks, or how you think in this case, the momentum behind the movement to decarbonize Canada's sectors is unfolding in terms of citizens, businesses, and governments.
Sure. Thanks very much, Flo. Really excited to be tackling this very big topic. So I'm going to start, because everybody remembers the first thing you say, to say that I feel like we might, and I'm going to emphasize that word might, finally be on the cusp of significant effective action. As many of you who've been in this industry for a long time know, we've done over 30 years of trying to address climate change through target setting, supporting technological innovation. But I think it would be a good generalization to say that I don't think any of us has really seen the results that we were hoping to see. So we're in this kind of realm of cusp of significant and effective action. But I will say that despite the significant amount of investment that is about to be pumped into our economy and the emphasis on climate action, we are still underestimating the scale of this challenge and not really fostering the public-private partnerships that are going to be needed. We are still in the realm of incremental action versus market transformation and not putting enough emphasis on several critical issues. Being transformational and enabling public-private partnerships requires institutional innovation, establishing the political will, cross-sectoral capacity, and involving Canadians as part of the solution. You referenced people, Flo, in that opening. Our institutions have been built over many decades, aiming primarily at reliability and low cost to our energy users. And those are attributes that are going to stay with us through this energy transition. However, we now have additional attributes that need to be weighted equally to reliability and low cost, things like the environment, equity, and inclusion, and we're not yet weighting them in the same way. So this is going to require new governance structures, new business models, significant updates to policy, legislation, and regulatory structures that actually enable these multiple beneficial outcomes to be achieved, and that we're not doing yet. That type of innovation is impossible without coalitions of public support and the political will to address systemic change. It's not just about spending money and the implementation of technology. It's about a degree of political change, which is probably unprecedented in Canada's history. It also requires that we establish capacity across all of society to achieve the outcomes we seek. Without the skills, the knowledge, the tools, equipment, and people required to achieve net zero, we will not get there. And we are very far from having all those capacities in place. And that last one, that people piece that you also referenced, is perhaps the most critical in this pathway. Canadians need to be brought along in the process. We need to understand the costs, the impacts, and the opportunities that net zero offers. And we need to be empowered to make useful contributions to the overall objectives and see ourselves as part of the solution. So these items, this institutional innovation, political will, capacity, and people, those are our accelerants that will help or hinder us in our ability to accomplish the goals that we've set for ourselves. They must have equal attention to the tangible, measurable, and visible items that governments are currently focusing on if climate and economic success are truly to be on the table. So back to your original question, we have more momentum than ever before. We are ready to put in the effort and the resources to make it happen, but we're still not fully appreciating the scale of the challenge, and we are remaining incremental in our approach.
Okay, well, there's a lot in what you shared here. So I'm going to turn to Adam and ask you about the priority sectors in Canada's federal climate plan. And frankly, are those the right ones? Are those the best areas to focus on for, I suppose, the greatest gains?
Yeah, thanks, Flo. And I'd like to echo a lot of what Tonja just said. I think that was a really eloquent synopsis of some of the challenges that we face and some of the interconnectedness that we haven't quite figured out yet. And so I guess when I think of the sectoral focus, I'm going to focus on what's keeping me optimistic these days, which is that I am starting to see that, especially as we grasp with the reality, the scientific imperative of net neutrality, it is forcing us to have a much more complex and much more interconnected conversation on what it's going to take to get there. If you think about how we've talked about climate change, up until very recently, it's been all oil and gas, right? It's been energy, transportation, buildings, phasing out of fossil fuels. That's been sort of the limit of the conversation. And it's been, I think it's done a disservice to...
Sorry, Adam, I apologize. We're having a little technical issue and I just want everyone to hear what you're saying. So if you can just give us 1 second, To everyone who's watching, I apologize, and if you can hear me, apparently we're having a little audio glitch. So just give us 1 second. I'm watching the monitor for. Okay, we're back. Do you mind, please, starting at the beginning of your answer, Adam? Apologies, everyone.
Okay, well, I started by commending Tonja on a very, I think, astute assessment of the complexities that we're still not fully grasping when it comes to the scale of the challenge of decarbonization. But for me, what I've noticed certainly in the industry, in the world of industry and heavy industry decarbonization, is that there is a maturing of the conversation. I think that's being driven in part by the realization, or I guess the sudden coming to terms with the fact of what net zero actually means. In fact, I don't even like to use net zero because it's got to be zero, actual zero, and maybe even less than zero in order to truly avoid what we believe will be the worst consequences of climate change if we fail. And the positive of that is that the conversation is now evolving beyond the fairly narrow focus that has been largely around energy, in particular fossil energy, the need to phase out fossil fuels. And I think that conversation has been very constraining. And certainly as the cement sector, we've been raising our hand saying, I mean, fossil fuels, yeah, it's part of the decarbonization of our sector. We use fossil fuels for heat, but it's actually a very small part of the decarbonization challenge for our sector. And it also doesn't allow a more complicated, intersection of the funding, investment, policies, partnerships, technologies, et cetera, that are going to be required to decarbonize our sector and how they relate to the challenges that other sectors also face. So what's positive is that I now see, first of all, that the conversation around what sectors are important to the conversation, well, all of them. It's not just about energy anymore. It's about heavy industry. It's about all hands on deck. And it started also a conversation around the interconnectedness of technology plays, things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and I could list a whole bunch of others. Maybe we'll get into it in the conversation, but that are an important part of the ecosystem and a important part of the systemic change that is shared by a whole range of sectors. The building sector is obviously connected to building materials, energy use, and what we do on the manufacturing side has to be linked to decisions that are being made about how our products are being used in the value chain. That is now starting to become a real conversation. Governments are starting to think about it in their development of policies and other measures, and that to me is very hopeful. But I agree with Tonja, we are just at the tip of the iceberg. It is only just beginning.
Mm-hmm. Robin, I'm going to turn to you, and obviously, in your role, managing such a significant piece of infrastructure, if I can put it that way, for Canada that underpins many sectors, if not all sectors of our economy. But at the same time, you have the beautiful view of the West Coast and the mountains, and the whales and all those images we have in our mind when we think of Vancouver. Perhaps the most difficult question for you: how do we balance economic growth and climate action from your unique vantage point?
No, it's a great question, Floyd. It's something we spend a lot of time thinking about. And I'd start by saying, I think, by actually recognizing we have to achieve both. And too often the debate becomes polarized and really loses the common ground and momentum by virtue of arguing about the polarity. And I think to put a bit of scale around it in the way we think about it, so the port in Vancouver is as large as the next 5 ports in Canada combined. $500 million of cargo a day is traded through the port. $1 in 3 of Canada's trade beyond North America in goods. So we see a huge part of the economy. And it was brought home to me one day talking to a couple of ministers in Saskatchewan, provincial ministers, and one of them said, if you shut the port in Vancouver, you might as well switch off the lights in Saskatchewan. So much of Saskatchewan's economy gets to market through the port system. Most of that is grain and is potash fertilizer. It's products that are going to be in demand around the world, feeding the population. And moving those products to market has a significant carbon impact. So we need to solve both problems. We can't just stop moving goods to market, but we absolutely can't continue on the trajectory we've been on in terms of actually reducing carbon in the system to get to zero. And I would share the views that we've heard from both Adam and Tonja that I think we are starting now to see a real change in momentum, which is really positive. But I think we're also starting to understand the scale of the problem. I mean, getting to the targets, looking at our system, getting to the targets that Canada has signed up to for 2030 looks really challenging. We're making good progress, but we're not making enough. And I'd just close it out by saying we set our vision as being the world's most sustainable port. We've defined that as combining economic prosperity through trade, a healthy environment, and thriving communities. We have to deliver all three.
I'm going to stay with you, Robin, because you talk about this polarization of debates, which is Canadian, but it probably applies in many other countries on many other issues than sustainability. Which parties need to come together or to collaborate to achieve decarbonization of our industries? Again, from your vantage point.
I would say that everybody has a role. I mean, there is. And along with what Tonja was saying, I mean, the pressure that we're seeing growing up in public opinion to deliver real change is actually helping accelerate that change and cause that change to happen, which is a really critical catalyst. But we also need to see industry, as we are doing, start to take significant action, because it's not just consumers that can make the change. It actually has to be sort of driven by industry. And there's no doubt in my mind that the government has a significant role to play in two ways, both in terms of setting out the regulatory framework that drives us collectively towards the targets we need to meet. And also critically in terms of stimulating the development and uptake of technology, which is going to help us deliver the change. We can't get to where we need to get without new technologies being developed, proven out, and implemented on a large scale. And government has a role to play in that just as much as those in industry who will be implementing the technologies. So it really is, the short answer is everybody.
So obviously in the last year, we've seen incredible disruption and, everything has sort of been upended or turned upside down, and we've had to adapt, obviously. It's, I suppose, also had, sort of a silver lining that we've perhaps realized the technologies we have at our disposition, the fact that we can achieve, a lot remotely, for instance, and that people obviously will go where the information is to be found or where the conversations are to be found, which today's panel is evidence of. Tonja or Adam, what's the best way to engage all stakeholders, including, as we pointed out, Canadians, to sort of continue this momentum towards industrial decarbonization? Who wants to take this one?
I can throw a few thoughts in there. I mean, collaboration is a huge part of the work that we do at an association. And I think about collaboration in different kind of buckets, right? So it sort of depends on what part of the puzzle you're trying to move. Obviously, collaboration is huge when it comes to technology and financing, when you get down to the actual development and implementation of technologies. But it's also been really important in Canada to move the policy needle on climate change. We work very closely with academia, with government partners, with environmental groups to try and find alignment so that we can actually push policies that are going to have impact. And I would say the same when it comes to public engagement, like, industry needs to partner with a range of other stakeholders on just communicating that, what needs to be done, that it's positive, that that this is not all downside, that there are opportunities, and to help sort of cut through some of the rhetoric that, that's I think held us down or slowed us down a little bit. But in my sector in particular, when we look at our decarbonization roadmap, it is absolutely clear that collaboration down the value chain of our product is essential to get to zero. So there's only so much we can do on the manufacturing side. We also need the users of our products to work with us on implementing innovations that we can offer into the market, but also to think differently about how our materials can be used in the broader decarbonization objective.
Tonja, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah. No, I agree with everything that's being said. I just want to bring a kind of the local perspective into this conversation as well. I completely agree that we need to see leadership through industry and through our governments in order to enable a lot of this change. But we talked about people. We talked about, you and I as individual Canadians, and how do we engage at that local level? And I think one of the things that maybe is playing to our advantage in this regard is, if you think about sort of how historically our energy systems have been built across Canada, and therefore built based on need, right, essentially, but with a top-down model. What we are now seeing is because we have downloaded the responsibility of dealing with climate change, of dealing with the built environment, of the issues like energy poverty and clean drinking water to local, what we have now done is given local the power to help direct how our energy future plays out. And so the engagement of that local level is more important than it ever has been in the past. They have typically been just sort of receivers of the energy system that has been provided to them, but now they're starting to play a much more important role in kind of directing how the energy system evolves going forward. So to Robin's point, to kind of answering your first question or your initial question here was, we need to engage everybody and we need to be engaging all the way down to that grassroots level.
If I stay with you for a moment, Tonja, the way I see Quest is it functions as well a little bit as a hub. And so I'm wondering what types of collaborations are needed for success, how they should be structured, but also we often talk about polarization, but I think there is also a lot going on in terms of bringing people together in Canada, perhaps more than ever today. Would you agree with that? And what do we need more of is perhaps the question.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely are starting to see more and more of that collaboration. I think that the reason why is because there's not one entity that actually holds all the levers that we need in order to drive ourselves forward to net zero, whether that's net zero emissions or absolute zero. There's a number of different stakeholders that hold varying different abilities, and we need all of them pulling together in order to get to the outcomes that we're looking for. So a shorter answer, I guess, to your question, but yes.
That's good. Robin, I'm going to turn to you. What is the current state of decarbonization in the transportation sector or even the shipping sector today?
Yeah, I would say, building on what Tonja's saying, we're seeing significant gathering momentum, but we also have to be realistic. If we look at a Canadian level, transportation is the second largest sort of sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. In BC, it's actually the largest. So, and it's in many ways, I guess everyone says this for their own sector, but the problems are some of the most complex to solve as I look at them, as I'm just immersed in them. But, we're making some really good progress. So, here in BC, we have a fantastic advantage, of course, of having hydro available, which is 95% carbon free. So the more we can move to electrify systems in the port, the better. Our stakeholders around the port have made substantial progress on that. And we now have the ability, for example, to plug ships into hydro when they're alongside at 5 or 6 of our berths. We're trying to bring forward a pilot for electric trucks. We have a lot of the mobile equipment on terminals is already electric. If we move to the marine sector, again, we're seeing huge momentum starting to build. Just today, in fact, in my media clippings, there was a piece of advocacy by all of the worldwide shipping associations to the IMO as part of developing a $5 billion fund to decarbonize marine shipping fully. But recognizing it's that sort of money that needs to be spent just to start making the transition, never mind actually sort of the normal money that would be spent within the system. So there is a lot of good work happening. The challenge we have as a port, we've got a full emissions inventory for our port system and all the partners who play a part in it. We are bending the curve. We're significantly reducing unit emissions per ton of cargo shipped, but cargo's growing, going back to that balance of economy and environment. And we're even adopting all of the currently known technology within the next 10 years. We don't hit Canada's targets as a system. So we need new technology to be developed and adopted by 2030 just to hit Canada's 2030 targets. So I'd say that there is great momentum. There are a lot of really good things happening, and we're making real progress, but the targets still look daunting.
Adam, I suppose some of at least what Robin just said applies to the cement or frankly the construction industry as a whole. Some of the challenges are quite daunting. What is the current state of decarbonization in your view?
Yeah, very similar story. I mean, obviously, we've been making progress on decarbonization for, in reality for decades, but against the backdrop of a much less sort of urgent policy and market signal that, as we've talked about, that signal is getting much louder. And so we're seeing, that reflected in the level of investment and effort going into the decarbonization in cement and concrete, but also, of course, further downstream by those who use the products for buildings and infrastructure. We've made a commitment globally, and all the Canadian companies have signed on to aspire to carbon neutrality by 2050. And in Canada, we're actively now developing a technology roadmap that I hope will see targets set for 2025 and 2030. We can make big progress if the policy and market signals align. I think that we could make 30, maybe 40% reductions compared to, say, to use the Paris baseline 2005, which would be a significant jump. After that still leaves 70 to 60% decarbonization to that carbon neutral goal, and that's where things get really, really challenging. And that depends on technologies that are still, that we're very optimistic about, things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, but which will require things outside of our industry's direct control to develop in a positive way. And we are more and more confident that they will. But there's no denying the fact that while significant, there's still significant sort of low hanging fruit. The long term challenge is huge. And
when you say outside of the industry or outside of the activities, are you hinting at fiscal or regulatory kind of incentives?
That's definitely part of it. I mean, there's huge, capital barriers, for example, to some of the bigger technologies like CCUS. But if we were to stick with that technology as an example, you can capture carbon today. It's expensive, but it can be done. But what do you do with it? And where's the infrastructure to transport that captured carbon to end uses, whether that's storage or some of the emerging technologies around, in our sector, using that CO2 in the concrete itself as a sequestration mechanism.
Yeah,
those are beyond the scope of our sector alone. Of course, fertilizer, steel, others, oil and gas are all looking at the same technology. And so I guess what I mean is that common sort of infrastructure and financing environment needs to develop in a way to make those technologies work at scale.
Mm-hmm. And Tonja, cities or buildings are often also pointed to in terms of, their emissions, their carbon footprint. How far along are we in terms of decarbonizing our cities, our buildings?
I think we can all say that we're not as far along as we'd like to be at this point in time. But, the building sector, I think, is actually quite interesting because perhaps unlike some of the other sectors that have just been talked about, I think the majority of the tools are already in our toolbox. We know how to build zero emission buildings. We know how to make buildings that generate energy, or even sort of net zero neighborhoods at the neighborhood scale. We know how to do that, and many leading builders are really building above above code, above the sort of standard, as it were. And there's a couple of really great tools out there. So I'm going to reference BC's Energy Step Code, which is a kind of incrementally rigorous code, which encourages over time progress. So, I think from that perspective, we're making some good headway. But the bigger issue really exists not so much with the new infrastructure, but with the existing infrastructure that we have. And so, that's I'm obviously talking about retrofits, which is very front and center in a number of government economic recovery initiatives. But there's still two main issues with that. One is capacity, and the second is that it's a disaggregated market. Not many building owners and managers have the capacity to plan and undertake deep energy retrofits, even when there's funding there to do it. So we need support systems that actually, kind of like tailored services that enable that full scale uptake and ensure consistent social, environmental, and economic outcomes come out of doing those retrofits. So there's a few stakeholders in the marketplace that enable that kind of thing, such as an organization called Ecosystem out of Montreal. We're kind of on the cusp there. As it relates to the disaggregation of the market, this is, I think, where the bigger issue really exists. Institutional investors require minimum transaction sizes that today the disaggregated retrofit market doesn't meet. So we need to appreciate beyond just the return on investment. We need to appreciate the importance of resilience and emissions reductions, health and avoided costs, and also stack public grant funding with private financing options. So that is not yet happening yet. And we're also seeing, because municipalities or communities across Canada are really trying to tackle this big challenge, we don't have a standardized approach to dealing with retrofits. And so we're getting a lot of piecemeal solutions. The other issue, and I know you want to move on, that I want to quickly touch on is we don't often understand the importance of land use at the local level and where we actually put our infrastructure. So it's all very well to have net zero buildings or buildings that have received deep energy retrofits, but if they're not placed in transit hubs where people can live, work, shop, play, we use more energy just to service them. And that sprawl model, which is so prevalent across Canada, embeds higher energy use due to the fact that it takes more energy to provide the services that are needed. So I would say that the state of the building sector offers promising potential, but still there's a number of challenges that are really standing in their way to really see the results that we need.
A few of you started talking about technologies. We heard about carbon capture and storage. I'd like to hear a bit from Adam, especially about that. You talked about, Tonja, you talked about energy efficiency and retrofits. I mean, there's no shortage of solutions, I suppose. So I'd love to hear from each of you, perhaps in just 1 minute. Let's start with Adam. What do you think are the most promising technologies in your area, let's say? In terms of, their impact, basically. And I would say also how fast we can adopt them here in Canada and hopefully, take advantage of those economic opportunities too.
I guess I would divide them into two buckets. There's the near-term stuff, like the decarbonization of our fuel supply. There are lower carbon cements that can be produced today where we haven't fully capitalized on the carbon reductions of those technologies. And the challenge there is not technological, it's policy. It's actually hard not to burn coal in a cement kiln in Canada because the provincial policies haven't modernized to make it easier to attract investment in some of the lower carbon alternatives. That's something that's starting to change. Government procurement has been a barrier to the adoption of lower carbon cements. It's a very conservative industry, the construction industry, especially when it's construction that's being done through governments. And so, I think the lowest hanging fruit is really policy innovation to allow existing technologies to be fully deployed. When I look to the future, it is these, more complex systems like carbon capture, utilization, and storage. But for cement and concrete in particular, that technology is exciting because we can provide solutions both to capturing the carbon, but also become a repository for that captured carbon by, there are technologies, for example, that make aggregates out of sequestered carbon that can be used instead of normal aggregates in concrete. And suddenly your building becomes a carbon storage mechanism. Take the industrial carbon from cement manufacturing and you store it in the structure that ultimately needs that cement. So it's that kind of circularity sort of circular economy of carbon that I am most excited about in my sector for sure.
Very, very exciting. Yeah, absolutely. Robin, what about you? I often wonder how long it'll take for ships to be electric, but that probably is far, far off, isn't it?
I think electric ships is quite a long way off. I was going to talk about two, actually, electrification and actually about the sort of change in shipping. Electrification first. For sort of shore-based equipment loading ships, it's proven, it's been there for years, and it's sort of, with hydro, it's a fantastic solution. The moment you get to something that has a wide range of movement, a truck, the current example would be a new container truck, costs about $180,000 if you buy a diesel truck, costs about $500,000 if you buy an electric one, and the electric one doesn't have the same range. So it's catching up. I mean, I've got an electric car, I've had it for 5 years, it serves my driving needs perfectly, but it's not quite there yet from a technology point of view or a commercial point of view for industry. But so there's more, it's coming, but it's not there yet. On the ship side, we're very excited about the opportunity presented by LNG. And of course, Shell are a big participant in LNG out here on the West Coast. We also have Fortis locally. It's not going to get immediately, it doesn't get to zero, but it gets us a lot of reduction that scales all the way across the Pacific if we can have vessels refueled with LNG. Typically, converting a ship to LNG reduces its greenhouse gas emissions by 20%. BC LNG reduces it by nearer 30% because it's hydroelectric compression, so you're not burning off fossil fuels to compress to create the LNG. So LNG is a great transition, which is going to be a part of a several decade transition in terms of marine shipping. And then when you look at marine shipping, other things like hydrogen and ammonia are also being talked about. I think batteries I don't see for a long, long time, but a lot of work is going into these fuels that can either be making significant reductions now, and that's where LNG has a fantastic role to play, or in the longer term as the technology matures, getting to a sort of a source of energy that's created in a completely sort of carbon-free way to fuel the ship, which could be hydrogen, could actually be synthetic LNG, or could be ammonia. So lots happening. Again, not as fast as we'd like to see, but at least it's happening.
That's kind of a running theme on this conversation. I kind of have to move to your calls to action, but I want to give you maybe 20 seconds each just to tell us, where do you think we will be by 2030 in decarbonizing Canada's industries? Tonja, really 20 seconds if you can.
I'm not sure where we'll be, but we need to be a lot further ahead than we are right now. So, I think it depends on whether or not we are willing to take on the systemic issues. If we're not going to make progress as fast as we want. But dealing with the systemic issues is also going to take a little bit of time. So it's a bit of a, dichotomy, I guess, between these two competing priorities.
And Adam, 20 seconds. Where will we be in terms of decarbonization in basically 9 years?
Well, it's hard to disagree with Tonja on the uncertainty around how things will unfold. But let's assume that this momentum that we're starting to feel today continues and gets stronger and grows. Like I said, in our roadmap, and this is consistent with what governments are starting to expect from our sector, I'm hoping 30-40% reduction in carbon from our sector by 2030. But I won't commit to that until our roadmap is finished.
It's measurable and it's on record. And Robin, 20 seconds or less?
Yeah, I think we will be substantially better than we are today. So we're making huge progress, but I don't yet see the paradigm shift that we need to get to the Paris 2030 targets that Canada signed up to. So we'll be better than we are today, significantly. We'll have made good progress towards those targets, but I don't yet see enough to make sure we hit them.
Well, we appreciate your honesty, all three of you. So now moving to your calls to action. I'm hoping and fairly sure that you've taken some time to prepare them. I'm going to give you 1 minute each. And the question is the same. Who must do what now to drive decarbonization in your industry? I'm going to start with Tonja.
Put me on the spot. Okay. You framed that a little bit differently than you gave it to us to prepare, but that's okay. I think the kind of the who of needs to come together. I think we've kind of touched on that, right? It is, we need to have people coming together in multiple, so cross-sectorally in multiple different ways. And we need to bring the right people together who have the levers, who can actually affect change. So really if I could sum up my call to action here, it's for every one of you to think bigger, think systematically and less so sectorally, right? We will accomplish this. I mean, 2020 taught us this. We will accomplish this. We will deal with these wickedly complex issues and succeed if we do it together.
I like it. I'm still going to ask Adam if he can try to focus on his sector. And by the way, these are the questions in the run of show. Who must do what now to drive decarbonization in the cement and let's say the broader construction industry? 1 minute.
Well, I will, I guess, build on the theme of systemic change and say, the most important thing is that governments need to stay the course. This is a market transformation challenge. And the market can't transform without certainty. And one of the hugest drags on the decarbonization of our sector, and I think this is true across the entire economy, is just the uncertainty of the investment environment around and the seriousness of the commitment to decarbonization. And so I think if we start to see a lot more flip-flopping on some of the policies out there, and carbon pricing is the most notable of them, but it's certainly not the only signal that governments are sending. But we need to stay the course on the commitment to climate change. And if markets know that we're serious, then the money will flow. And if the money flows, the decarbonization technologies will follow.
Very clear, very clear. And Robin, what about the shipping industry and broadly the transportation industry?
I think I'd summarize by saying everybody has a role to play, as we've been discussing. I think industry needs to continue to lean in and provide leadership, and we're seeing great examples of that. And I think government has to focus specifically in the areas of creating the right regulation that stimulates the change and really stimulating the development, adoption, and implementation of the technology change that we're going to need to achieve the targets we've set.
Nice and short and sweet. Thank you so much. So we're going to switch now to the Q&A. And as I said earlier, we've been having questions from before we even launched into this conversation. So it's going to be about choosing which ones. We have a lot. So I'm going to start with a question from Sarah Robinson. It says ministerial comms. I don't have more details. It's a little long, so hang with me. It says, all panelists have spoken to the same theme of collaboration, yet silos amongst industries seemingly exist still. In the social service sector, there is a proven outcome-driven model known as collective impact. It calls upon all actors in the respective ecosystem to work in a structured way towards shared results. There are 5 conditions. Now, here's the question. If we were to apply such a model to achieve a decarbonized future, who, from your perspectives, needs to be the backbone or the driver? Who wants to take this one?
I'll take a go at it. Well, we'll give the other two some thinking time. I think to achieve the scale of change that we're talking about, government has to take a leadership role because so many of the pieces come down to needing government collaboration. And I don't mean by that no one else is doing anything, quite the reverse. There's a lot of activity going on, and I would actually argue, I'm not aware of the model that the question talks about, but there is a lot of collaborative work in structured ways going on around industry, and indeed with industry and government at the table as partners. But I think it's government that has the most levers at its disposal, and it's also government that can pull the wrong levers if they're not careful. So I think government has probably got the leading role, but that doesn't in any way diminish the role of the other parties at the table.
Anyone else want to build on that? Otherwise, I have.
Yeah, if I understand the question, one of the dynamics that I think most industries wrestle with is the need to work together towards collaborative solutions, which are going to be common to the sector or even a group of sectors, versus the competitiveness imperative to try and use leadership in this space as an opportunity to get an edge on your peers, right? And so that's I know a tension that we're constantly trying to work out. Like what are the solutions that we can collectively advocate for, and which are the solutions that the companies are going to kind of fight it out amongst themselves to be the first to market with. And I think it's absolutely critical that we find the right balance there. You want the competitiveness driver to spur innovation and to create leaders that will help pull the rest of the market along. But there are certain challenges that absolutely require an industry approach, and it's difficult to know exactly when and how to do that.
I'm just going to really quickly jump in and say I agree that I do think the main leader is government, but I will say that government will not have the ability to do it without the public support to make it happen.
Okay. Well, there's a question about government that I find quite interesting from Rowan Nuttall. Apologies if I butcher the pronunciation of your names. Many people disagree that we need new technologies to solve this problem, decarbonization, but rather the issue is scaling up the penetration of our current portfolio of solutions. So the question is, how should government manage this when it comes to regulation and policies? And what fraction of spending should go to R&D versus encouraging uptake of existing technologies?
I'll jump in on that one to start. Yeah, I think that we absolutely need to see the deployment of the technology that we have at our disposal right now. And I think Adam was talking about this earlier. We just don't yet have the policy environment or the regulatory structures that actually enable that uptake. So as far as kind of the balance of where we should be spending our money on the R&D versus creating those mechanisms. I'm not sure that it's 50-50 per se, but we certainly need to. We've done a lot of spending, I would say, on developing technological solutions and on that innovation space from a technological perspective, but we haven't equally invested in the ability to deploy those technologies. So perhaps we need to kind of balance or put our focus in the enabling the conditions for the next little while in order to get those technologies into market.
And hopefully some of those technologies are Canadian, right?
Ideally, yes.
Ideally, yeah. Robin, this one is for you, and it builds a little bit on my question earlier about electric ships. So it says, question for Robin, what about hydrogen for shipping? Why is it only being talked about, quote unquote, and why lock ourselves into LNG?
I'm not the perfect person to answer this because I'm a ports person, not a shipping person. I would say hydrogen is being talked about a lot. The advantage LNG has is that it's available today and in use today. We had an LNG powered vessel call in the port last year. We can't yet provide LNG as fuel for those vessels. By next year, we should be able to. The hydrogen supply chain is just not as developed. So it's not, but let's be clear, it's not, from my understanding and my reading of the issues, it's not either or. It's there are technologies at different stages of maturity, and to achieve the goals that we have collectively globally, when we start to talk about marine shipping, all of those technologies are going to need to be deployed. They probably phase in different ways.
Yeah, I do feel like hydrogen is a bit of a hot topic, and perhaps also a major economic opportunity, especially for Alberta, for instance. Does anyone want to speak a little bit more to that potential? I guess that's a no.
Well, it's very early, right? It's, it's early, not early in the sense that hydrogen's been sort of on the menu for decades now. But there is this renewed interest, and I can say certainly in my sector, there's real interest in trying to understand where it might fit in our decarbonization roadmap. But it's so nascent, it's very hard to really say anything intelligent about where it might go at this point.
Yeah, and I think from the kind of local perspective, because there is this urgency declaring climate emergencies in local governments, for instance, we're trying to forge ahead, and those technologies such as hydrogen that can play in the future that are not quite there yet, we have to be really careful not to shut them out. So we need to be careful in the decisions that we're making that leave ourselves open to being able to use those technologies in the future, even though they're not ready at scale yet.
Yeah, great points. Here's another question. What key things are needed to make the market signals align, quote unquote? Is this inevitable, or are there specific things that could be done to accelerate this?
I would just go back to my point about predictability and policy certainty. It's really the underlying fundamental principle of investment is the more you can de-risk the investment space by creating, conditions that are very predictable, the easier it is to make investment decisions. So,
yeah.
If I can jump in on that as well, I think just to add a layer of complexity from looking at the port perspective, so we sort of sit looking at the nexus of international trade. There is also a really complex challenge that domestic governments have to grapple with, which is competitiveness with other countries. And in our case, it's the big neighbor next door. I mean, as carbon tax in Canada moves towards $170, if carbon tax in the US is not moving in the same direction at the same rate, going back to the very original question about the economy versus the environment, we will both damage the economy in Canada potentially, while also not achieving the environmental goals because of the substituted movement of some of the industries that can move. So that's not to say carbon tax is the wrong tool. It's just to say that none of these problems are so simple that we can just look at them on a one jurisdiction basis.
Well, I just got a sort of a somewhat contrarian question here, so maybe I'll stay with you, Robin, and others can build on it. Someone just wrote, do you see the election of U.S. president? Sorry, that someone is Bart Edis, who's Distinguished Fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, therefore in your city in Vancouver. Do you see the election of U.S. President Biden, who has quickly rolled out the most aggressive climate agenda of any U.S. administration, putting pressure on Canadian provincial and national authorities to take more ambitious steps to tackle the climate crisis?
I think then Bart may be more qualified to answer that than me. I mean, it's not my sphere of expertise. What I would say is, though, that I think what we see is increasing alignment globally around the fact we have to be dealing with this issue. I'm going to get right back to the first question. I mean, how are we going to balance the economy and the environment? The first thing is by recognizing that we have to address both. And I think at the end of the day, governments around the world are increasingly starting to build that recognition into their policy making. And I think that's important. But beyond that, I'm afraid it's an area that's going to political science more than port management.
We'll invite Bart on the next panel then. Thank you, Bart. Anyone else want to tackle this? I have a few more questions before we wrap up otherwise. No, you're good. So, again, we talked earlier about the deployment of existing technologies. Now, this question asks, how important will incentives be for the development of new technologies in a highly competitive global market? This question comes from Pam Sholak.
I mean, I think if you assume that we start to that this momentum carries and we do a better job of implementing the technologies that are already deployable today and scaling them, that there will become this will take on a life of its own. That's the objective, right? And so, it ideally will be in a place where the market will be producing these solutions because that's what the market is demanding. And right now we're just sort of at this difficult phase where we're having difficulty deploying the stuff we already know how to do, let alone sending a strong enough signal for independent market development of scalable technologies for the future. And so that's what transition is about, right? And that's what we're trying to figure out is how do we get to that kind of self-sustaining phase where continuous improvement on carbon reductions is just part of what the market does.
Yeah, I think that's you're touching on what I was speaking about in the opening, which is moving from incrementalism to transformative. And if we are successfully moving to transformative, then those incentives are less necessary.
Yeah. I have a couple of very specific questions here for anyone who wants to take it. How does carbon price policy need to change? I guess that's suggesting that it needs to change. Are there other levers that need to be produced to make pumping out emissions uneconomical? So carbon policy and other, I guess, regulation or policy that might be needed. No?
I would just sort of build on what Adam said sort of a couple of times. I think it really is a key point that if I look at the port system, I mean, investments in the port system have a duration of 30 years or more. I mean, a 30-year investment is a fairly standard investment term, and I'm sure in the cement industry it's the same as in many large industries. So really having stability and visibility, long-term visibility is critical. So I think that sort of whatever policy levers are being used, having that long-term picture is fundamentally important, and having that long-term picture that actually is stable, so that the investments that are made with a view to the life cycle timeline of the investment, and that predictability is rewarded. Without that long-term predictability, either the investments don't happen, or worse still, if the long-term predictability is changed midstream, you have stranded capital and investors who aren't willing to invest again. So I think, particularly looking at it from an infrastructure perspective, really having long-term clarity is really key.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think it's even more important in the case of the energy system as a whole. Those infrastructure assets have a life well beyond 30 years, right? Pipe infrastructure has life at 60 years is kind of the baseline. So again, like even more important that we have those long-term objectives, because what we invest in today will still be with us in 60 years' time. So we have to make really good decisions and know that the return on that investment is going to stay true. We're not going to end up with those stranded assets.
I have about 2 minutes left, but I really want to ask you two more questions because they're really good. This one is, we've seen that the government is taking the lead on climate change from a policy front and in providing investments to emerging low carbon technologies through SDTC, Enercan, etc. What can be done to reverse this so that the private sector is leading the charge to reduce emissions? I just need a 30-second answer, if at all.
I would argue it doesn't need to be reversed, and the private sector is already heavily engaged in reducing emissions. I think it's actually, there is good collaboration taking place.
Okay. Anyone else, very quickly?
100% agree. Yeah, there's a huge amount of private sector investment happening, and government programs are designed to, in fact, attract more of that investment.
I will say that I think that the government programs, they need to level the playing field. We have an unlevel playing field right now. And to give you an example of that, anybody can access $5,000 today to retrofit your home. Most of us here on this call probably don't need that, but there's many low-income Canadians, marginalized Canadians who do. And so we need to level the playing field, and that's a role for government to play.
Here's my favorite question of all. What is something you learned during this panel from one of the other panelists? And I really need to give you 20 seconds each because we need to wrap up. Who wants to take that?
I'm going to say I learned from both that we're grappling with the same problems in different sectors and seeing a lot of the same challenges and opportunities. How about that?
That's a cheeky answer.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also really appreciate Tonja's ability to articulate some of the other layers that go beyond the kind of narrow world of heavy industry that I tend to be focused on, to draw in some of the sort of people scale challenges and needs that we face in this challenge as well. So thank you for that.
And Tonja, you're on the spot now. You want to share some?
Yeah, I am on the spot. I learned a lot about the shipping industry. Didn't know that things like, how hydrogen would play in that future. So thank you, Robin, for bringing some awareness. I deal in transportation, but in the kind of world of public transit and individual personal vehicles. So that was really interesting to learn more about. Thank you.
I can ask you questions all day. Clearly, our audience has a lot of questions. I'm sure a lot of us need to get back to work. Thank you so much, Tonja, Adam, Robin, for your time and for having this really, really rich conversation with us today. We're going to launch another poll very quickly right now to assess what our audience thinks is the most important to achieve industry decarbonization. You're going to have three options: coordinated industry commitments, cross-sector research and development, regulatory incentives, or the right infrastructure. Perhaps you want to think about your answers too, panelists, even if you can't vote right now. And I just want to finish by saying, if you enjoyed today's panel, make sure to visit TheFutureEconomy.ca. Check out our full series on Canada's future energy pathways, presented by Shell. A big thank you to them again. We've done 2 panels before. They're on the site, 3 interviews, very interesting, talking about scenarios, about Indigenous participation in the energy transition. And there's an interview about decarbonization there as well. The results should be coming up on the screen imminently. There they are. So number 1 is regulatory incentives with 51% of our respondents. The number 2 would be cross-sector research and development, then coordinated industry commitments. And the last one is the right infrastructure. I don't know if that means we have the right one already. I'm not sure. Thanks again very much to everyone who participated, to Shell, to our 3 panelists. Really appreciated your time, flexibility, and to you, the audience, for joining us today. And also to my team at TheFutureEconomy.ca, Tim, Hannah, Oliver, Matt, Lisa, Israel, who's doing the tech right now. Thank you very much, because I certainly couldn't have done this without all of you. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you.